There is a cemetery in Middle Village, over in the center of Queens, that you could drive past 100 times and never look at twice. St. John's. Flat rows of headstones, a few larger tombs set back among the trees, the low hum of traffic somewhere behind them. On an ordinary weekday afternoon, it is one of the quietest places in New York City. I have gone back to this cemetery more often than I can easily explain, because of what is in the ground here. Within a short walk of one another, under stone that gives away almost nothing, lie some of the most feared men this country has ever produced. Two of them matter most to what follows. One is Carlo Gambino, who built the most powerful criminal organization in America and died of old age in his own bed. The other is John Gotti, who made that same organization the most famous in the world and died in a prison cell. The distance between their graves is a few minutes on foot. The distance between their two deaths is the entire story. Consider a few things before we begin. One of these men was shot to death in a barber's chair, a hot towel over his face, in the middle of a Manhattan morning. Another was gunned down on a crowded sidewalk outside a steakhouse at the evening rush by shooters in matching trench coats and fur hats, on the orders of the man who wanted his job. The man who gave that order and took that job died of cancer in a prison hospital 16 years later, after spending his last decade in a cell. His own right-hand man, who might have saved him, instead admitted a role in 19 murders and testified against him, the highest-ranking member the American Mafia had ever produced who agreed to talk. One boss was torn apart by a car bomb meant for someone else. One vanished so completely that his body was never found. One was shot dead outside his own home as recently as 2019. At its height, the family was estimated to take in something like $500 million a year, and to command more than 2,000 men. And one of them, the man the whole family is named for, died of a heart attack in his own bed. An old man, never convicted of anything that held. The clubhouse, where much of this was commanded, sells clothing now. The hotel barbershop where the first of those men died pours coffee for a national chain. And the family name, after every one of these men was buried or locked away, was still turning up in New York courtrooms, on racketeering cases that were still producing guilty pleas as recently as last year. Every one of those things is in the public record. None of them is the strangest part. This is the story of the family that built the most feared criminal empire in America. A name so durable that federal prosecutors still type it onto indictments today, decades after the men who made it famous were buried or imprisoned. It is also the story of how almost none of those men got to keep what they built, so that the one who died quietly in his own bed became the rare exception to a rule the rest of them proved with their bodies, that the throne could be seized but almost never held, and that the name grew more permanent in exact proportion to how completely each man who wore it was destroyed. I want to start in the cemetery because it is the one place where all of them finally agree. Before we go in, one small thing. Subscribing helps build a quiet audience around work like this and rewards the hours that go into making it. Chapter 1. The Cemetery. St. John's Cemetery covers a long stretch of Middle Village, a working neighborhood set down in the center of Queens, hemmed in by row houses and parkways and the ordinary machinery of the borough. It has been receiving the Catholic dead of New York since the late 1800s. Most of the people under its stones lived and died without notice, which is the fate of nearly everyone. But across the middle of the 20th century, a particular kind of New Yorker began arriving here in numbers, and St. John's became, without any ceremony or plaque to mark it, the most important cemetery in the American underworld. Lucky Luciano is here, the man who organized the modern mafia into something that could outlive any single boss. Carmine Galante is here. Joe Colombo is here. Agnello Della Croce, who will matter a great deal later on, is here. And so are the two men this account keeps circling back to. Carlo Gambino lies in a family crypt behind marble that announces nothing. At his death, in the autumn of 1976, he was the most powerful organized crime boss in the United States, the head of a family that carried his name and would go on carrying it long after him. He died of a heart attack, at home, an old man, in danger from no one. In a life spent at the summit of an organization that killed people as a matter of routine, he served, in total, less than 2 years behind bars, decades earlier, on a minor charge. By the standards of his profession, that is very close to a miracle. A short walk away stands the Gotti family mausoleum, and inside it, John Gotti. For a few years at the end of the 1980s and the start of the 90s, Gotti was the most famous criminal alive, a boss who wore hand-tailored suits to court and waved to the cameras on the courthouse steps and beat one prosecution after another. He died in June of 2002 of cancer in the hospital wing of a federal prison in Springfield, Missouri, after spending his last 10 years in a cell he was never going to leave. What strikes me every single time, standing between those two graves, is how little the place finally distinguishes them. The stone is the same gray. The name is cut the same way. A man who died free in his own bed and a man who died a prisoner 1,000 miles from home have ended up a short walk apart, behind the same kind of marble, and the cemetery draws no line between them. Everything these men did, everything the entire organization did across 70 years, was arranged around the difference between those two deaths. The cemetery dissolves that difference in a single afternoon. That is the thing I want to hold on to going in. The Gambino family at its peak was the richest and most feared of the 5 families that ran organized crime in New York, which for most of the 20th century meant the most feared in the country. It had, by the estimates of the investigators who tried to measure such things, something on the order of 2,000 made men and associates, and an income running into the hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It controlled concrete and construction, garment trucking, stretches of the waterfront, gambling, loan sharking, and 100 smaller rackets underneath. In the flat language of the FBI charts, it was a criminal enterprise. In its own language, it was a family, with a founder, an inheritance, and a name that had to be protected at any cost. And almost every man who ever held the top of it came to a bad end. I am not pressing a lesson onto them. What the cemetery shows is closer to a pattern in the data, the kind you can see from the ground itself, where the men who spent their lives fighting over the name all ended up in the same few acres of Queens, no matter how the fight came out. To understand how the name arrived here and why it outlasted the men who bore it, you have to go back before there was a Gambino family at all. Back to a set of men who came off boats from Sicily with almost nothing in their pockets, and to the city that taught them what to do with it. Chapter 2. The Palermo Men. Salvatore d'Aquila came to New York from Palermo in the first years of the 20th century, one among hundreds of thousands of Sicilians who crossed in that period into the tenements of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. He was quiet, careful, and intelligent, and within about a decade, he had made himself the single leading mafia boss in the city. The organization he assembled is, by the most direct line anyone has been able to trace, the one that would eventually be called Gambino. Before it was Gambino, it was for a while simply d'Aquila's, and before that, it belonged to men whose names have dropped almost entirely out of public memory. The world these men came from had its own long history. In Sicily, and above all in the country around Palermo, there had grown up over the 19th century a shadow system of private power that filled the space the state could not. A network of men who offered protection and settled disputes and took their cut, bound together by silence and by blood. When Sicilians emigrated in enormous numbers around the turn of the century, a small fraction of them carried that system with them and set it down again in the crowded Italian districts of American cities, where the newcomers were poor, distrustful of the police, and easy to lean on. In New York, the early form it took was crude. Extortion notes, often signed with a smeared black handprint meant to frighten, demanding money from shopkeepers and laborers under threat of harm. The newspapers of the day lumped it all together under a single, lurid label, the Black Hand, as if it were one vast conspiracy rather than a scatter of gangs. By the standards of what came later, it was small business, a matter of squeezing frightened immigrants for what little they had. The men who ran it were feared on their own blocks and unknown 2 neighborhoods over. What changed everything was prohibition. When the sale of alcohol became illegal across the United States in 1920, an entire national appetite was handed overnight to whoever was willing to break the law to satisfy it. The men who already had the discipline, the muscle, and the habit of operating outside the law were positioned perfectly. Across the 1920s, the money coming off illegal liquor turned street gangs into wealthy organizations, with trucks and warehouses and payrolls and politicians on retainer. A generation that had been shaking down bakeries found itself running a business the size of a real industry. D'Aquila rode that rising tide to the top and sat there through most of the decade. But power at that height, in that world, has always attracted the next man who wants it, and in the autumn of 1928, D'Aquila was shot dead on a Manhattan street near his own home, on the orders of a rival. Control of his organization passed to one of his lieutenants, a man named Alfred Mineo, who held it only briefly. Within 2 years, Mineo too would be killed, caught up in the war that was about to tear the whole New York Mafia apart. I want to slow down on one detail here because it sets a pattern that repeats to the very end. D'Aquila built the dominant family in the city and ran it for years. And when it was taken from him, it was taken the only way such things were taken, with a gun, on a sidewalk, near his house. He did not retire. He did not lose an election. There was no mechanism in this world for a boss to simply step down and grow old in safety. The chair was held until someone stronger wanted it, and then it changed hands over a body. That is the inheritance the whole family was built on, and it was written into the organization long before anyone named Gambino sat at the top of it. The man who would eventually take that name to its peak came from the same soil as all of them. He was born in the province of Palermo around the turn of the century, into that same Sicilian tradition of silence and blood. And he came to America as a young man during the years when Prohibition was turning the old street gangs into something far larger. His name was Carlo Gambino, and for now, he was nobody. A young Sicilian working his way up inside an organization at war with itself. To understand the war he came up through, you have to understand the killing that everyone in this account would spend the next 40 years either avenging, imitating, or trying to avoid. If you have read this far, you already know whether this is your kind of story. When it is, subscribing is the simplest way to tell me to keep going and to catch the next one when it lands. Chapter 3: The Barber's Chair. On the morning of October 25, 1957, a heavy-set man settled into a chair in the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel on 7th Avenue in Manhattan for a shave and a haircut. The barber draped a hot towel over his face. A moment later, 2 men walked in behind him, drew pistols, and fired. The man in the chair, blinded by the towel and taken completely by surprise, is said to have lurched up and lunged at the reflections of his killers in the mirror before he fell. He was dead on the floor of the barber shop within seconds. His name was Albert Anastasia, and at the moment he died, he was the boss of the family that would one day be called Gambino. To understand how Anastasia came to be in that chair and why someone wanted him out of it badly enough to kill him in a 7th Avenue hotel in broad daylight, you have to go back to the war that made the modern mafia. By the end of the 1920s, the New York underworld had grown too large and too rich to hold together peacefully, and around 1930, it broke into open conflict, a citywide gang war remembered as the Castellamarese War, after the Sicilian town many of the combatants came from. Dozens of men were killed. When the shooting finally stopped in 1931, a younger generation had come out on top, led by Lucky Luciano, and they set about reorganizing the whole thing into a stable structure that could hold. Out of that settlement came the 5 families of New York, each with its own territory and its own boss. And one of those 5 was handed to a man named Vincent Mangano. Mangano ran the family for 20 years, with Anastasia serving underneath him as a senior figure. Anastasia was a different kind of man from the careful bosses around him. He had come up as a fearsome enforcer, and during the 1930s and 40s, he was closely tied to the crew of contract killers the press later called Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm that carried out killings on behalf of the national syndicate. He was reportedly involved in a great many deaths, and he inspired real fear even among other criminals. Mangano and Anastasia are said to have loathed one another for years. In the spring of 1951, that long tension resolved itself in the way these things always did. Vincent Mangano simply disappeared. His body was never found. Around the same time, his brother Philip was discovered shot to death in a marsh near Jamaica Bay. It was universally understood in that world that Anastasia was behind both, and that he had reached for the top the only way the top was ever reached. The ruling commission, presented with the situation after the fact, chose to accept it rather than start another war. Anastasia became the boss. He held the family for 6 years, and he ruled it with the same appetite for violence that had carried him up. That was what finally undid him. A boss who kills too freely and too visibly frightens the other bosses, because he makes the whole arrangement unstable. And an unstable arrangement is bad for the one thing all of them care about, which is money. By 1957, a quiet consensus had formed that Anastasia had become a problem. The details of who ordered his death and who carried it out were never established in any courtroom, and much of what is believed about it rests on the later word of informants. But the broad shape of it has never been in serious doubt. Powerful men decided Anastasia had to go, and among the men who profited most from his removal was his own quiet, patient underboss, Carlo Gambino. Anastasia was killed on a Friday morning in a barber's chair with a towel over his eyes. It is worth sitting with that image for a second because of what it says about the position these men spent their lives climbing toward. Anastasia had reached the very top of one of the most feared criminal families in America. He had money, soldiers, and a reputation that made hardened men lower their voices. And none of it bought him the ordinary safety of a shave in a midtown hotel. The higher a man climbed in this organization, the better the view and the shorter the odds. The barber's chair was no accident of Anastasia's story. It was the logic of the whole thing, made visible on a tiled floor on a Friday morning. Out of the aftermath, Carlo Gambino stepped up and took the family, and gave it the name it still carries. He had watched, up close, exactly what happened to a boss who ruled by fear and drew too much attention. He was about to spend the next 20 years demonstrating that he had learned the lesson better than anyone. But before we follow him up, we have to look at the institution he was rising inside, the strange and formal structure that governed all of this, and the code that held it together. Chapter 4. The Commission. In 1931, in the settlement that ended the Castellamarese War, Lucky Luciano did something that outlasted every individual boss who ever sat at the table. He created the Commission. The idea was simple and, in its way, almost corporate. Rather than let the families keep destroying one another every time a boss died or a territory shifted, the most senior bosses in the country would sit together as a kind of board of directors, a ruling body that could settle disputes, approve or forbid killings of made members, divide up territory, and keep the peace that kept everyone rich. The 5 families of New York formed the core of it, joined by the leaders of the major families in other cities. It gave the American Mafia something no gang had ever really had before, a structure designed to survive the death of any one man. Bosses would come and go, some in bed and most not, but the institution would continue. Underneath the Commission, each family was organized with a clarity that would not have looked out of place in a legitimate corporation. At the top sat the boss. Below him, an underboss, his second in command. Alongside them, a consigliere, an advisor and mediator. Below that, the capos, the captains, each running a crew of made men, the soldiers who had been formally initiated. And beneath the soldiers, the wide base of associates, the men who were not full members but who did the work and took most of the risk. Orders flowed down through those layers and money flowed up through them, and the layers themselves were what let a boss give a command without a single word that could be traced back to him. Holding the entire structure together was a single principle, and everything depended on it. Omerta, the code of silence. A made man swore never to cooperate with the authorities, never to acknowledge the organization's existence, never, under any pressure, to inform on his brothers. In exchange, the family was supposed to take care of him and his, to stand behind him if he went to prison, to look after his people. It was, when you strip away the ritual and the blood oaths, a working contract. The men at the bottom absorbed the danger and the prison time on the understanding that no one would ever talk, and that silence protected the men at the top, who took the largest share and ran the least risk. For decades it held. That was the quiet miracle at the center of the American Mafia, and it is the thing whose eventual collapse ends this account. For a long time the arrangement worked so well that the country's top law enforcement officials could pretend the organization did not even exist. That pretense ended abruptly on the 14th of November, 1957, just weeks after Anastasia was shot in his barber's chair. On that day, roughly 100 of the most important mafia figures in the United States gathered at the country estate of a man named Joseph Barbara in the small upstate town of Apalachin, New York, for a national meeting. A local state police sergeant grew suspicious of all the expensive out-of-state cars and moved in. The gathering scattered in a panic, men in silk suits running through the woods, and dozens were detained. The raid was a humiliation for the men caught in it, but it was a far greater humiliation for the officials who had spent years insisting there was no such thing as a coast-to-coast crime syndicate. After Apalachin, that was no longer possible to say with a straight face. Even so, the tools to actually dismantle the families did not yet exist. For most of the 20th century, the law could only reach individual crimes committed by individual men, which meant it could occasionally catch a soldier, but almost never touch a boss who had given an order through 3 layers of underlings and never dirtied his own hands. That changed in 1970 when Congress passed a federal law aimed squarely at racketeering, a law that made it a crime to run a criminal enterprise through a pattern of illegal acts, and that let prosecutors hold the head of an organization responsible for the crimes he had directed. When it passed, almost no one understood what it would eventually do. It sat on the books, quiet and unused, for years. It is the most important thing to carry out of these early years, and it will come back at the end to take the whole family apart. If you want the rest of this, the surest way to see it is to subscribe. It is free, and it tells the channel to keep making things like this. Chapter 5. The Quiet Boss. Carlo Gambino did not look like the most powerful criminal in America, and that was the entire point. He was small, soft-spoken, and unremarkable to look at, with a large nose and a mild, almost apologetic manner. He dressed plainly. He avoided restaurants where he might be photographed. He gave no interviews, made no speeches, courted no reporters, and for most of his reign, the general public would not have known his face if he had sat down beside them on the subway. Among the men who understood the business, he was regarded as the shrewdest boss of his generation, a patient strategist who preferred to arrange things quietly rather than settle them with bodies. He had watched Albert Anastasia die in a barber's chair for the opposite approach, and he had drawn the obvious conclusion. Gambino took control of the family in 1957 in the reshuffle that followed the Anastasia killing, and he gave it the name it has carried ever since. Over the next 19 years, he built it into the dominant of the 5 families, and he did it with a discipline that his successors would spend the years after his death failing to match. He kept a low profile. He kept the peace on the commission, where his judgment carried enormous weight. He put his people into the parts of the New York economy where quiet, steady extortion could go on for decades without anyone important making a fuss. The rackets under Gambino were vast and, by design, largely invisible to the ordinary New Yorker who lived off them without knowing it. The family had deep control over construction, where nothing large got poured in concrete without the mob's involvement and its cut. It ran much of the trucking in the garment district, the center of the American clothing trade, where his own son Thomas would come to oversee the family's interest, and where the surcharge the family skimmed rode quietly on the price of clothes sold all over the country. It held pieces of the waterfront, of trucking at the airports, of gambling and loan sharking across the city. Money came up through all of it, in a steady, enormous, unglamorous stream. There is one decision from Gambino's reign that tells you how his mind worked, and it concerns narcotics. The drug trade was the richest opportunity of the era, and plenty of men in the families chased it. Gambino, like a number of the older bosses, officially forbade his people from dealing drugs. He did not do this out of any tenderness of conscience. He did it because drug charges carried very long sentences, and a made man looking at 30 years in prison was a made man who might, for the first time, be tempted to break omerta and talk to save himself. The narcotics ban had nothing to do with conscience. It was risk management, the calculation of a man protecting the code that protected him. It is a small thing, but it shows you the whole cast of his mind. He thought several moves ahead, and he understood that the real danger to the family was never the police. It was the possibility that one of his own men might one day decide to speak. I have spent a fair amount of time trying to work out what made Gambino different from the men who came before and after him. And I keep landing on the same unremarkable word: discipline. He wanted money and power exactly like all of them, but he wanted them quietly, and he was willing to forego the pleasures of being feared in public in order to hold on to the substance of being powerful in private. He did not need the city to know his name. He needed it to keep paying. It did. And so he arrived at the ending that almost no one else in this whole account gets. In the middle of October, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack at home on Long Island, an old man in his 70s, in his own bed, at the head of the most powerful crime family in the United States. He was not in custody. He was not on trial that would have mattered. No one was coming for him. He had spent his entire adult life inside an organization built on murder. And he died the way a retired banker dies, quietly, of natural causes, having outlived his rivals and kept his name. Crowds came to the funeral. He was buried at St. John's in Queens, in the cemetery where this account began. And here is the fact that everything else in the story bends around. Carlo Gambino was, in the most literal sense, the exception. He built the empire, he named it, and he is very nearly the only man who ran it who got to die like that. Everyone who came after him inherited the empire without inheriting the discipline that made it survivable, and one by one, they proved it. The first of them was already waiting. He was Gambino's own brother-in-law, a huge, business-minded man who was about to move the boss of the most secretive organization in America into a mansion on a hill, in full view of everyone, including the FBI. Chapter 6. The White House. On a rise called Taut Hill, the highest point on Staten Island and one of the highest on the whole eastern seaboard, there stands a very large white mansion. It has a columned portico, a circular drive, and a deliberate resemblance to another, more famous White House in Washington. It was built at the end of the 1970s for a man named Paul Castellano, and for most of the decade that followed, it was the seat of power of the most powerful crime family in America. It was also, in a way its owner never suspected, the instrument that helped take him down. Paul Castellano, known to everyone as Big Paul, was Carlo Gambino's brother-in-law and his cousin, a heavy-set, imposing man who had spent his career on the business side of the family rather than the street side. When Gambino died in 1976, he passed the family not to his fearsome, long-time underboss, Agnello Della Croce, but to Castellano, and he tried to keep the peace by leaving Della Croce in charge of the traditional street crews. That division satisfied no one completely, and it planted a resentment that would eventually get Castellano killed. Castellano ran the family the way the head of a corporation might. He was drawn to the white-collar rackets, the construction cartels, the concrete, the garment trucking, a chicken distribution business he had a personal hand in. He was less interested in the street earners, the men who hijacked trucks and ran the loan sharking and did the ugly close-up work. And they in turn came to see him as an aloof executive who took a large cut of their labor while looking down on how they earned it. He spent more and more of his time up on the hill behind his columns, apart from the men whose loyalty a boss in that world could never actually afford to lose. The rackets he presided over were enormous. By the estimates of the investigators who tried to measure such things, the family under Castellano may have taken in something on the order of $500 million a year. He had a personal hand in a Staten Island concrete company that held a near monopoly on the borough, and in a poultry distribution business that supplied chicken to shops and restaurants across the city. And through the family, he drew on the construction cartel that quietly decided which firms poured the concrete for the largest projects in New York. On paper, he was closer to a corrupt executive than to a street criminal, and he seems to have thought of himself that way. But he was still the boss of a mafia family, and in the spring of 1984, a federal grand jury indicted him along with much of his leadership, part of a broad assault the government was only beginning to mount against the families. The respectable business he had built was starting to close in on him from two directions at once, and the Hill is where the law finally got in. In the early 1980s, the FBI managed to hide a listening device inside the mansion, in the heart of Castellano's own home, and for months, it recorded the private conversations of a man who believed himself untouchable behind his own walls. There is something worth pausing on in that. Carlo Gambino had made himself safe by owning almost nothing anyone could point to, by being no one the public could name. His successor made himself a fortress on the highest hill he could find, and the fortress became the single richest source of evidence against him. By the standards of the boss who built the family, Castellano had the logic of survival exactly backward. Safety in that world had never come from walls. It came from being impossible to see. Castellano had built the opposite. The break, when it came over the one rule Carlo Gambino had cared about most. Castellano, like Gambino before him, forbade his people from dealing narcotics, on pain of death, for the same cold reason that drug cases carried the sentences that made men talk. But a crew close to a rising captain named John Gotti had been caught on federal wiretaps dealing heroin, and Castellano learned of the recordings and demanded to hear them. The men on those tapes understood exactly what it meant if their boss heard them break his most serious rule. They began to fear for their lives. And the one man whose authority might have held the peace between the boss on the hill and the crews in the street, the old underboss Della Croce, was dying of cancer. Della Croce died on the 2nd of December, 1985. Castellano did not go to the wake. To the traditional men of the family, and above all to Gotti, who had loved the old underboss like a father, staying away from that wake was an insult that told them everything about the kind of boss Castellano had become. Within 2 weeks, the men Castellano had held at a distance for a decade made their decision. Subscribing is how work like this keeps finding its way to you, and it does not cost you a thing. Chapter 7. Sparks. At around 5:30 on the evening of the 16th of December, 1985, 2 weeks before Christmas, a black Lincoln pulled up outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan, in the office blocks east of Grand Central, in the thick of the evening rush. Paul Castellano was in the passenger seat. His newly chosen underboss, Thomas Bellotti, was driving. As the two men stepped out onto the crowded sidewalk, several men in matching light trench coats and dark fur hats closed in around them and opened fire. Castellano and Bellotti were both shot dead on the pavement, in full view of the Christmas crowds, in the middle of one of the busiest districts in the world. Across the street in a car, a captain named John Gotti watched it happen, and then rode slowly past the bodies to be sure the work was done. It was, by the standards of a world that did most of its killing quietly and out of sight, an act of staggering boldness. Gotti had not merely killed his boss, he had killed him without the approval of the Commission, the ruling body whose entire purpose was to prevent exactly this, the unsanctioned murder of a sitting boss. It broke one of the oldest and most serious rules the American Mafia had. Gotti was betting that once it was done, and once he was installed, the other families would accept the new reality rather than go to war over a man most of them had not much liked anyway. The bet paid off. Within weeks, John Gotti was acknowledged as the new boss of the Gambino family. To understand how large a gamble that was, you have to understand what Gotti had broken. The rule against killing a boss without the Commission's approval was no small piece of etiquette. It was the load-bearing rule of the entire post-war peace, the thing that had kept the families from tearing one another apart for half a century. A boss who could be killed on the private initiative of an ambitious captain was a boss no one could feel safe being. By reaching for the top the way he did, Gotti had taken the Gambino family and, at the same moment, told every other family in the country that the old protection no longer held. Some of the other bosses wanted him dead for it, and they did not wait long to answer. He rewarded the men who had helped him. Frank DeCicco, a respected captain who had turned against Castellano and helped plan the killing, was made underboss. And here, the pattern that runs through this whole account asserted itself again, quickly and without mercy. On the 13th of April, 1986, only months after the Sparks killing, DeCicco walked to his car outside a social club in Brooklyn, and the car exploded. He was torn apart by a bomb that had been planted underneath it. The killing is believed to have been ordered by rival bosses in retaliation for Castellano, and the bomb may have been intended to catch Gotti as well. Gotti was not there. His new underboss absorbed the blast. He had held the job for months. The scale of all this was not lost on the men whose job was to watch it. A boss had been shot down in the street in Midtown. His successor's own second-in-command had been blown apart within months, and the Gambino family had become, almost overnight, the most turbulent and most closely watched criminal organization in the country. The quiet that Carlo Gambino had spent 20 years building was gone. What replaced it was noise, and noise, in this business, was the thing that got men caught. I want to slow down on the Sparks killing itself because it announced everything about the man who ordered it. The murder of Albert Anastasia, nearly 30 years earlier, had happened behind a closed barbershop door in a quiet hotel in the morning. It was violence meant to be done and then absorbed into silence. The murder of Paul Castellano was the opposite kind of act. It was staged in the most public place imaginable, at the busiest hour, in a way that could not be missed or hushed. The killing was a performance as much as a murder, and it told the whole city that a new kind of boss had arrived, one unafraid of being seen. That was the thing about John Gotti. He was unafraid of being seen. That fearlessness was the source of his rise, and it was going to be the cause of everything that came after. The same appetite for spectacle that made the Sparks hit so effective as a statement also made its author the most conspicuous criminal in America, at the exact moment the government was finally assembling the tools to take a boss apart. Gotti had announced himself to New York. He had also announced himself to every prosecutor and FBI agent who read a newspaper. For a few short years, none of that seemed to matter, because John Gotti could not be convicted of anything. And for a while, the whole country watched him prove it. Chapter 8. The Teflon Don. The photographs from those years all show the same thing. John Gotti on the courthouse steps in a hand-tailored suit that cost more than most people in the courtroom made in a month. His silver hair swept back, smiling for the cameras as though he had arrived for a premiere rather than a criminal trial. The tabloids, delighted, gave him names. First, the Dapper Don, for the suits. Then, after he kept walking out of courtrooms a free man, the Teflon Don, because nothing the government threw at him would stick. Between 1986 and 1990, John Gotti beat 3 separate prosecutions. In one, a racketeering case, the jury acquitted him, and it later emerged that one of the jurors had been bribed. In another, an assault case, the victim developed a sudden and total inability to remember what had happened to him. Each acquittal made Gotti seem more untouchable than the last, and each one made him more famous. Crowds gathered outside his social club in Little Italy. Neighborhoods threw him fireworks displays. He became, in a way no American mob boss had ever been or had ever wanted to be, a celebrity. The spectacle around those trials was like nothing the New York courts had seen. Supporters packed the galleries. Vendors sold shirts with his face printed on them. When the verdicts came back not guilty, the crowds outside cheered as though a hometown team had won a championship. His defense lawyer went at the government's witnesses with a ferocity the tabloids adored, and Gotti played to the room, relaxed, smiling, certain the state could not lay a hand on him. For a stretch of years at the end of the decade, that certainty looked like plain fact. 3 times the government came for him, and 3 times he walked out the front of the courthouse, a free man, into the flashbulbs. This is the place to stop and look directly at the contrast that the whole story has been building toward, because it is the center of everything. Carlo Gambino built the most powerful crime family in America and died in his own bed. And he did it by making sure that the public never learned his face, and the government never had a reason to make him a priority. John Gotti inherited that same family and made himself the most recognizable criminal on earth. He gave the government no choice. A boss the whole country is watching is a boss the whole country's law enforcement must bring down, or admit it cannot. Gotti had taken the one asset that had protected the family for 50 years, its invisibility, and he had traded it for applause. I have gone back and forth on how to think about this, and I keep coming to the same conclusion. Gotti was not a stupid man. He understood the business he was in, but he wanted something Carlo Gambino had never wanted and had specifically avoided, which was to be seen, to be admired, to walk down Mulberry Street and have people cheer. And wanting that was, in the arithmetic of his profession, a fatal error, because the one thing the modern American state could not tolerate was a criminal who was more famous and more beloved than the officials trying to catch him. Carlo Gambino had understood that the family's greatest enemy was attention. His most famous heir went looking for it. The cost of all that attention was building quietly the entire time. Even as Gotti beat case after case in public, the government was doing the patient, unglamorous work that would eventually bury him. There were tape recordings being made. There was a body of federal law passed years earlier and finally coming into its full power that was designed for precisely this problem: the boss who ordered everything and touched nothing. And there was a man very close to Gotti, a man who had helped him take the family, who was beginning to understand that his boss, given the choice, would sacrifice him without a second thought. None of that was visible from the courthouse steps. While Gotti smiled for the cameras, agents were doing the patient work of getting microphones close to the places where he actually spoke, and prosecutors were assembling the kind of case that did not rest on a single frightened witness who could be scared into silence. The very confidence that made Gotti so magnetic in public, the belief that he could say whatever he liked and never pay for it, was about to become the government's sharpest weapon. A more careful man would have said far less. Gotti, by temperament, could not. If you have come this far, this is the kind of thing you clearly want more of. Subscribing is the way to make sure it keeps arriving, and it costs nothing at all. Chapter 9. The Bull. The law that finally worked had been sitting on the books, quiet and half-forgotten, since 1970. It was the federal racketeering statute, and its great innovation was to make the enterprise itself the crime. A prosecutor no longer had to pin a single murder on a boss who had ordered it through 3 layers of underlings. He could instead prove that the boss ran an organization that committed crimes as a pattern and hold him responsible for the whole of it. For years, almost no one grasped what the law could do. Then, across the 1980s, prosecutors in New York began to understand. Proof of what the law could do came in the middle of the decade, when a young United States attorney named Rudolph Giuliani used the racketeering law to put the entire ruling commission of the American Mafia on trial at once. The bosses of several families were convicted together and sentenced to 100 years each. For the first time, the law had reached past the soldiers and the captains and touched the men at the very top, the ones who had spent their whole careers keeping their hands clean. The tool that Carlo Gambino had never had to face The tool that could convict a boss for running the family rather than for any single act was now proven and sharp. And John Gotti, the most visible boss in the country, was the obvious next target. Prosecutors built the case the way the modern cases were built, with recordings. Agents managed to plant a listening device in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, the club Gotti used as his headquarters, and there they captured him talking freely, in a way no careful boss ever should have, about the workings of the family. On some of those tapes, Gotti spoke about his own underboss, a man named Salvatore Gravano, called Sammy the Bull, in terms that a careful listener could hear as laying groundwork to blame him. Gravano was a hardened, disciplined man who had come up through the family and risen to its second in command. He was also, when the tapes were played for him, a man capable of arithmetic. Facing a racketeering case that would put him away for the rest of his life, and having heard his own boss preparing to hang the weight on him, Salvatore Gravano made the decision that no one of his rank in the American Mafia had ever made before. In the autumn of 1991, he agreed to cooperate with the government. He admitted a role in 19 murders, and he agreed to sit in a federal courtroom and testify against John Gotti. The highest-ranking member the American Mafia had ever produced had broken omerta, the code of silence that was the one thing holding the whole structure together. And he had done it not because the police had beaten it out of him, but because, when the moment came, he chose his own life over the family's. That was all it ever took. 50 years of silence, undone by one man doing the plain math of survival. It is worth being precise about the trade he made because it measures how far the old certainties had fallen. Salvatore Gravano admitted to a role in 19 killings. For that, in exchange for his testimony, he received a sentence of 5 years. And with the time he had already served, he was free not long after, walking into witness protection and a life under another name. 19 murders weighed against the rest of his days in a cell, and he chose the way almost anyone choosing only for himself would choose. The code had always depended on men valuing the family above exactly that private arithmetic. Gravano did the sum out loud, and the answer took the Gambino family apart. The trial in the spring of 1992 was not close. With Gravano on the stand describing the inside of the family in detail, including the Sparks killing, the jury convicted John Gotti on every count. On the 2nd of April 1992, the most famous criminal in America was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The crowds that had cheered him outside the Ravenite could do nothing. He was sent to a federal penitentiary and, in time, to the Prison Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, where his health failed. John Gotti died there of cancer on the 10th of June, 2002, having spent the last decade of his life in a cell, 1,000 miles from the city he had ruled in the open for a handful of dazzling, catastrophic years. He had made the name Gambino more famous than Carlo Gambino ever had. He had also delivered it, and himself, into the exact machine his predecessor had spent a lifetime avoiding. What was left after him was never going to be the empire. What was left was the name, and the ground it would be buried in. Chapter 10. The Names on the Stones. After John Gotti went to prison, the family did what it had always done. It continued, because the name was built to continue. His brother, Peter Gotti, a former city sanitation worker, took over as boss and lasted only a few years before he, too, was convicted under the same racketeering law and sent away, dying in a federal prison himself in 2021. The leadership passed on, quieter now, diminished, hunted, but the name stayed on the FBI charts and in the newspapers, because there was always another man willing to wear it. The last time the name made the front pages in the old way was in March of 2019. a man named Frank Cali, known to law enforcement and the press as the family's boss, was shot to death outside his own home on Staten Island on an ordinary evening. It was the first killing of a New York boss since Paul Castellano was gunned down outside Sparks 33 years earlier. The circumstances turned out to be stranger and sadder than the old mob killings, the work of a disturbed young man rather than a rival family, but the image was the same one this account keeps returning to. A man at the top of the Gambino family, dead on the pavement, a short drive from where Castellano had died the same way. And still the name did not die. In 2024, the New York State Attorney General announced charges against 17 people described as Gambino family members and associates, accused of running an illegal sports betting and loan sharking operation that handled more than $22 million in bets. In federal court in Brooklyn, a separate racketeering case against members and associates of the family, built around an attempt to control the city's carding and demolition trades, was still producing guilty pleas as recently as last year. Nearly half a century after Carlo Gambino died in his bed, decades after Gotti died in his cell, the family name was still being typed onto court paperwork by prosecutors who had not been born when the men who made it famous were buried. The places, though, tell a different story than the name does. The Ravenite Social Club, where Gotti held court and beneath which the recordings that convicted him were gathered, is a clothing boutique now, and shoppers walk its floor without knowing what was said in the apartment upstairs. The barber shop, where Albert Anastasia was shot in his chair, is long gone, and the space it occupied pours coffee for a national chain. The great white mansion on Tot Hill has been sold and resold. The men are gone, and the rooms they ruled from have been handed over to ordinary commerce, which does not remember them at all. Let me stop the chronology here, because the chronology has nowhere left to go. It would be easy to make this a story about crime not paying, or to make it a piece of nostalgia for some colorful lost New York of fedoras and social clubs. What the graves in Queens finally show is not a moral, it is a mechanism. The name was built to outlive the men who carried it, and it did precisely that. And the men themselves were, in the end, the most disposable part of the whole arrangement. What strikes me, standing with all of this behind me, is how completely the thing inverted the usual wish. A man ordinarily hopes to be remembered once he is gone. These men built an organization designed so that the name would be remembered and the men would not, and it worked exactly as designed. Carlo Gambino gave the family everything, including his name, and got in return the one death almost none of the others got. And it did not finally distinguish him. The ground took him on the same terms as the men who envied him. What survived was the name, on charts and in courtrooms and on paperwork filed last year. What did not survive was almost every man who ever held it. Anastasia in a barber's chair, Castellano and Bellotti on a sidewalk, DeCicco in the pieces of a car, Gotti in a prison hospital, Cali outside his own front door. The one who died in his own bed lies in Queens beside the rest, and the ground does not rank them. Which brings it back to St. John's, in Middle Village, on an ordinary afternoon. The flat rows of stone, the hum of traffic somewhere behind the trees, the quiet. Carlo Gambino behind marble that announces nothing, a short walk from the Gotti mausoleum. The man who died free in his own bed, and the man who died in a federal cell, a short walk apart, the family name cut into the stone over both of them. Stand in front of either crypt, and the stone tells you almost nothing. The discipline that bought one of them a peaceful death, and the vanity that cost the other his freedom, have come here to exactly the same place. The name they killed one another to hold is still in use, filed onto paperwork downtown by people who never knew them. The men who wore it are at rest in the same cemetery in Queens, where the stone is cut the same for the boss who got away with it and the boss who did not. That is what the cemetery has to say about the most feared empire in America. The name is still working. The men are still here. Neither one of those facts has ever had much to do with the other. This is the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.